Hello and welcome to episode 5 of the All You Can Board podcast. I'm Carlo.
I'm Dylan.
And on today's episode, our main course will be A Game Too Far. When exactly has a game gone too far? You'll have to stick around to find out. But before the main course, we're going to start things off, as usual, with a little appetizer. Dylan, what do you have for us this week?
Okay, so my appetizer is going to be about ambition in board games, and this is stemming from me having finally played Vantage. Braden invited me over, and we gave it a shot. I think Braden's played it like 7 or 8 times at this point, all solo, but him and I did a 2-player game of Vantage. And I'm not gonna give my thoughts on Vantage here, so if that's what you're hoping to get, you're gonna have to wait for that. But what I am going to say is that regardless of what my thoughts are, what I end up having to say about the game and my enjoyment of it, it is no question for me like it's an ambitious board game, both in its design and its execution, what it's asking of the players. It does things that are, unique in the board game space, even if they've been done before. It approaches them in a unique way. It does things that are completely, I've never seen a game do them, and I don't want to obviously spoil them here, but there's things that it's my first time seeing them done. And so this got me thinking a little bit about when we talked about Oath, Chronicles of Exile and something. I can't remember the full name.
Empire in Exile.
Empire in Exile. In that I felt the same way in or close to the same way, where regardless of where that ranks for me or where my end thoughts are, it's an ambitious board game. And I kind of started to think about the board game industry and hobby as a whole. And I guess I feel like there's not that there's less ambition, but in some ways it feels like because of the state of the world, the industry, costs, all this kind of stuff, that it's not that this has no bearing, and no, this isn't a comment on the quality of the games and how fun or good the games are, but more just that like I'm someone who loves Reiner Knizia designs. I wouldn't say that Reiner Knizia designs, the majority of them are ambitious. I would say that they're excellent games and, clinics of game design in many ways, but, a lot of them are rooted in the math of it and sort of how to make a compelling decision space or things like that, and he does that exceptionally well. But I play a game like Cosmo Lancer, for instance, and I'm like, oh, I love this, I want to play more of it. It's not an ambitious game, it's Knizia tile laying game, and it does some things differently, and I wouldn't necessarily call it ambitious. And I guess I've been thinking more about what it takes for someone to feel like they can be ambitious in the board game space because of how hard it is to be profitable, how hard it is to get a design made. I would say I have a hard time labeling crowdfunding games as ambitious because they have the benefit of getting all that cost up front. So the ambition comes easier, if that makes sense. So you still have to be ambitious. You still have to, make all that stuff yourself, the art, the designs, put that campaign up, get the funding, make people interested in it to be able to support it. But it's different than if you were, say, coming at it like Jamie Stegmaier did with Vantage and saying, some people might not like this. Some people this is just something I've wanted to work on. I've been plugging away at for 8 years, and he's able to do that because of the success of Stonemaier games with Wingspan, all this kind of stuff. And I guess not everyone has that luxury of having a successful Wingspan to be able to then say, I can take some time and develop this ambitious game that might not, hit anywhere close to a game like Wingspan and might be divisive, but it's something I feel passionate about. And I guess for me, passion and ambition are sort of like tied together and rooted together. And I guess it was a question I wanted to sort of throw out there to you, and then also just say everyone listening of, do you think that the state of things right now in the industry, in the world, people's, budgets being thinner because of the cost of inflation causing everything else to be harder to afford, is there less room these days for ambition because people need to develop a sure thing? They need to, make a 6th adaptation of Lost Cities after like a board game, card game, roll and write and everything, Rivals, something that like make another expansion for Wingspan, or is there still room for ambition out there? Because I guess I've been feeling lately that it's harder to find when there's less when it's harder to take a risk, I guess is what I'm saying.
Ooh, yeah, it's really tough to say. The one thing I want to talk about or touch on real quick first, and this is a nice little follow up to what we were talking about last week with the trends, and I mentioned the thing about like cutting corners and relying heavily on IPs, and that kind of relates this a little bit. But real quick, just about when you mentioned Knizia, I think for someone like him, it's more that his total body of work is ambitious more than his individual designs are. Like it's ambitious of someone to still be designing games after being at it for like 30, 40 years and having hundreds and hundreds in design credits and be like, yeah, I'm still going to design a new tile laying game. Like the idea of that strikes me as ambitious more than saying like this specific design of his. So just had to comment on that. I would say like Tigris and Euphrates is probably his most ambitious individual design, but that was, I think, 1997, so like almost 30 years ago. I think you're right, though. I think it's harder to take risks. First off, when times are tough, like economically, so whether that's like relating more specifically to tariffs or just the world post-pandemic, like we've seen a lot of companies that have shut down or had to lay off lots of their staff, and it's just, yeah, when you're looking to make profits and keep people employed and keep your company afloat, it's easier to, yeah, find like a game to, you know, either like rely on an IP that's successful, that has a big following, just go for making a bigger splash rather than kind of taking those risks. Like when you think of a game like 504 by Freedom and Friesa, that's incredibly ambitious. And I think he knew, as he knows with most of his games, that a lot of people probably aren't going to choose to buy this. It's expensive, but maybe that was a different time where he could justify, you know, spending that much time, first of all, designing this box that has supposedly 504 games all in one. But I think in general in the world right now with world news, social media, etc., like I think people are burnt out and just like mentally people, I get the impression, don't have a lot in the tank compared to maybe 5-10 years ago. So it's also maybe just harder to find the time and the mental energy and the, you know, the motivation to sit and innovate and try to find something, you know, a little more unique and
Yeah.
be ambitious. But it's also strange because in some ways it feels like the more competitive the industry gets, with more and more games being released every year, maybe you need to be more ambitious to really stand out. Like when I think of the hot releases of the past year or two, like even when we think about last year, we haven't played the Old King's Crown yet, but that's a game that has been like on a lot of people's top game of the year. Like a lot of people said it was their game of the year. You know, the I think the second printing just happened on crowdfunding and whatnot. And that's a first-time designer who designed the game and did all of the artwork himself. And by all accounts, it is a very ambitious game when it comes to the rules and what's actually in there. And that was like, you know, that's one of the big games of the year. That was very ambitious. Then you look at something like the Fate of the Fellowship, Lord of the Rings sort of take on Pandemic. And, you know, I haven't played it, so it's hard for me to comment on how ambitious it is, but obviously it's taking the Pandemic sort of base system and sticking the Lord of the Rings theme on there. From what I've read and heard, like, by all accounts, it does an extremely good job. Like, the game's getting rave reviews, and people are saying it's very thematic and very well done and stuff. So, and the fact that there is a lot more going on, it's a lot tougher. So I don't want to try to say that it's less ambitious, but just it's interesting to see that was just as successful probably as the Old King's Crown, and is more relying on like familiar gameplay, familiar theme, just sort of fleshing that out into a different type of package. So I think you can see both approaches be successful. But I think without, like, I think the ambition has to be there in the background in the industry at all times. Otherwise things will start to just get too stagnant overall.
Yeah, agreed. Like it's there's room and space for ambitious designs as well as ones like Fate of the Fellowship that or any other that take sort of existing frameworks and sort of evolve on them. Like I think both are important. I just think that the hobby would be being done a disservice if we lost the innovative, ambitious designs because it was not cost effective to pursue them. And that's, I guess, what it's on my mind and I worry about sometimes is how many designs do we not know about that are getting lost before they even get into development, because ultimately it's as cool as they are, or as interesting and unique as they might sound, a publisher or anyone involved in that side of things is looking at them and saying, I don't know that we can manufacture this right now because we don't know if we're going to get a return on it. Like, how would Vantage get made by, a company that didn't have wingspan to sort of carry it to production? You know what I mean? I'm not, and maybe that's the wrong way to word it, but I know that's part of it because of reading his blogs and some of the talks and stuff. Like, I feel like some companies have the liberties to take those risks and be ambitious, and others don't. But to what you said, I think it's important that people don't take that as a sign that you need to stop being ambitious and do things that are going to work. Because as a channel that is choosing to be ambitious in our pursuits and choosing a path that is, and I say ambitious because we're doing things that make it harder on us but are more aligned with our values, to me that's ambitious. And I hope that other people who really believe in something they want to do, like a design or whatever, are continue to be ambitious and don't sort of water them down to get them developed, even if they'll sell better. Because I think ultimately then we just end up with, and again, this isn't necessarily a knock, but we end up with like the Lord of the Rings trick-taking games that are innovating on the crew. We end up with Fate of the Fellowship that's innovating on Pandemic. We end up with Clans of Caledonia that's innovating on Terra Mystica. Those are all great, well-received games, but I don't want an entire hobby full of those, and where it becomes really like rare to see new designs coming up. You know what I mean?
Yeah. You know what? I'm glad you brought up the fact that just the feasibility of like the fact that you brought up that like it's through Stonemaier being able to publish a game like Vantage. I think it's a really good point because like Stonemaier, for those who don't know, is run by a guy named Jamie Stegmaier, and he himself designed Vantage. And I'm sure if he didn't have his own publishing company, if he just took that game design idea to other publishers, and especially if he was like a relatively unknown designer, or maybe didn't have like the credibility of someone like Knizia who we're talking about, a lot of publishers would have probably said like, this sounds crazy, like we can't justify publishing a game like this.
Yeah.
So my appetizer for this week is about player scaling. And I know we've said this with a few things before. This could obviously also be its own topic one day, and might be. But it's something that I've been thinking a lot about based on some of the games I've been playing. It's something that factors in a lot because we're often trying to... I mean, Dave commented on this at a recent game night of ours, that he notices we're very thoughtful about player counts for specific games more than a lot of the other people he plays games with, that we're like, oh, well, we could play this, but this would probably be better with 5 players, so maybe we'll wait till we have 5 next time, or that kind of thing. We're trying to plan around specific games with specific player counts. And so I was thinking about, I don't know, I guess it's just been on my mind through a lot of these games we've been playing. So over the past couple weeks, I played like Blue Lagoon, and that was a nice reminder of how efficient it can be to just say, if you're playing with four players, you each remove 10 tokens from your starting stack. If you're playing with 3 players, you each remove 5 tokens. If you're playing with 2, you use all of them. That's it. Everything else about the game is exactly the same. Scoring, every single rule, everything. The setup, it's just super easy. That's the only difference. We played Challengers, which you have that starting card. Even though this is a tournament-style game that goes up to 8 players, you have that starting card that just tells you which sort of seat to sit at every time. And you just take that card with you throughout. Otherwise, doesn't matter what player count. Obviously, the odd player counts, you're using the robot deck, the AI deck or whatever. But otherwise, it's the same game. And it's awesome that it works that well, despite having all these cards, right? There's a lot of games where they have cards that are in or out based on player count. And it'll say in the bottom corner, like 3+ or 5+. For the player count, you got to sort through all this stuff. Like Challengers cuts through that. And it's just like, here's your starting card. Just follow the instructions. Super easy. We played Ink and Gold. One of the sort of traditional push your luck games that just is a classic, never gets old. And in that one, there's nothing different about the setup as far as I remember. I mean, the only thing you're changing throughout the game is your level of risk, and your decision making changes based on, when you're deciding every round to leave the temple or not. Are there 3 players left? Are there 7 players left? The fact that it goes from 3 to 8 players, I believe, changes the way the game feels. But the setup and everything, the rules, everything is the same. And it's such brilliant game design to have these things run so smoothly. And then I thought it was interesting to look at kind of like some even older games and how their player scaling made the game feel more different across player counts. And so there's 3 games I'm going to mention. One is Carcassonne, and how from 2 players compared to 5 players, like you have this 74 tile stack. I think it's 74. So with 2 players, you're each getting, 37 tiles. With 5 players, you're each getting, I think it ends up being like 13 tiles or something, which is a massive difference, especially because no matter what, you get 7 meeples. So it really changes the game. We've talked about it before on one end of the spectrum with 2 players, it's very cutthroat. You're keeping in mind what the other player is doing. It's very, very back and forth. With 5 players, you sort of have to just take what you can get for yourself, not worry about kind of screwing your opponents over. You don't have enough turns to do that. You have to just worry about getting yourself points. We have Through the Desert, where it kind of just changes the size of the map that's available to you, as well as the camels in the piles that trigger the end of the game. And then I'm going to bring up Agricola, because in terms of player scaling, it's always the one that stands out to me as being the most different across player counts, where from every player count from 2 through 5, there are different action spaces available, and it also changes the sort of commonality or sort of like the resource market. Like at certain player counts, like for example, at 3 players, reed is in very low supply. It's a really, really stiff competition for reed, which is necessary to build rooms, to expand your house. And anyways, not going to get into the specifics, but I just find it interesting. I always loved that aspect of Agricola, how playing at different player counts made the game feel different and made it feel like you had to prioritize different resources or different action spaces, and the pressures of when to compete for them with other players happen at different times of the game. But I'm also having this appreciation for games where it's like, you don't have to worry about the players. You just set the game up and play. And I've just wanted to ask you, like, does one style sort of attract you more? Like, are you more interested in having a game play more similarly across player counts? Or do you like a game that feels like it's very different across player counts so you can experience how different it is?
I don't know if I like strongly feel that I prefer one over the other, but I would say that I prefer when as you change player count, all you're really doing is like what you described, like little setup things where there's less camels here, or we each get less cards in our starting hand, or the board becomes smaller or larger. I think that for me, when the game changes in drastic ways, across player counts, and this isn't always the case, like you brought up the Agricola example, I don't have experience with that, but that sounds not problematic to me. But when the experience starts to feel like, oh, the experience at 2 players feels like a very different game than at 4, that can be exciting, but it also starts to, like, the question then comes to me, or the one that goes into my head is like, what was the intended design of the game, like, and maybe there isn't one, but like that's where my mind goes, where it's like, if it plays very different, which game was sort of like the intended design, which player count was the intended design, and which one had to be accommodated, which one had to sort of become this other thing for it to be in the box. And like, it's more egregious when you have like a game that say is like a 3 to 5 player game, but then it says here's a 2 player mode and it has like these special steps to make it work with 2. That's like an egregious example where my preference is always like, it sounds like you designed a 3 to 5 player game, but we're told to make a 2 player mode, and that just doesn't sound great. But I don't know that I feel like super strongly about it. I would have to like think about it to see if I could find examples, and it's even just a good topic to be like, what are the games that scale in the most interesting ways, and that use the most novel ways to scale player count beyond just saying, like for shuffle, remove an additional 15 cards or add an additional 15 cards or whatever, versus like do this thing to accommodate the other players to make sure the game doesn't lose its integrity, or so to speak. But I don't think I feel super strongly one way or the other.
Okay. Even a game like Forest Shuffle, though, like based on the player count, you remove a bunch of cards. So I feel like that's one of the things I like so much about the 2 and 3 player counts is the variety of cards is higher, because you're not playing with everything. There's always a chunk of the cards that you're not getting to. So the variety in what you see through the game is more interesting, I find. Whereas with 5 players, it's just a little more predictable.
Yeah, totally.
All right. Well, I think we're going to leave it at that for the appetizers for this episode. But before we get into our main course, let's take a quick break to hear from our wonderful sponsor.
All You Can Board is proudly sponsored by Victory Pints, our local game store of choice here in Winnipeg, Canada. We strongly believe that Victory Pints is the gold standard of board game stores, not just here in Winnipeg. Their main priority is having a wide selection of games, many of which you won't find elsewhere. They ship Canada-wide, $15 flat rate, or free shipping for orders over $200, and even take requests to try and order in specific games. They also have a used game section where you can trade in games for store credit, and maybe even find some hidden gems that others have traded in. Note that the used game section is only available for in-person purchases and trades. Again, located in Winnipeg at the corner of Henderson and Hespeler, check them out at victorypints.ca. A massive thank you to Victory Pints for all their support over the years.
All right, we are back and it's time for our main course, which is A Game Too Far. So this is basically touching on when has a game gone too far? When has a game maybe crossed a line that makes you either not want to play it, not want to recommend it, that sort of thing. And I guess we should just really hammer out exactly what we mean, where this line is here, because, you know, is this like, I don't know if we're really saying, I don't think we're saying that this is like, under all circumstances, we would absolutely refuse. Like, it's not like this game is now sort of like blacklisted from us ever playing it, but I think it sort of has to be like, we're also not talking about it just barely crosses the line of something we would prefer to play or prefer to recommend. We're talking about like it's really over that line to the point where it's like egregious, right?
Yeah, I agree, and I think it's like you said, like it's very person specific and dependent. What is crossing a line or too far from me is going to be different from you, which is why it's a topic for us to discuss in the first place. But I think it's just good to point that out to people that are listening, that what we might say is too far might not be at all a concern that's even on your radar.
Yeah. And I don't know if you picked your ambition in board games appetizer after we decided on this topic or not, but I think it actually is an appropriate one as well, just because, you know, the more ambitious a game is, the higher chance that it can potentially cross a line, right?
Yeah, for sure, because it's usually trying things that are either more susceptible to like crossing a line with certain people, or there's just a wider amount of people that are going to be sort of divisive about it, and so it's going to be a bigger split compared to a more agreeable game like Catan or Wingspan, for instance.
Yeah. So the bulk of this topic is going to be focused on going through a bunch of different categories and talking about how a game could go too far in terms of blank. But before we get to those, we're going to just start with this question, which is it possible for a game to go too far, yet still be a good thing for the industry? And what we mean by this is sort of, if a game is, you know, pushing a certain boundary, if it's prioritizing innovation, maybe it's bringing an important subject to light, etc., but is there a point where a game can go too far, that game itself, but yet maybe we still look back and say, sort of like, I'm glad that game exists, or I'm glad this designer or publisher took this risk because it might pave the way for other games. So Dylan, can you think of any examples of games that exist that would meet this for you, or any games you'd like to see?
Yeah, like I'm not going to use it as my example here again, but just kind of to add it in there, like I think Vantage would qualify here. I think that for many people, it will have gone too far in different things that it did, but I think that it's good for the industry that we're getting that level of creativity and ambition and exploration in design. And the other one I'll use is Cozy Stickerville, which I just finished playing in its entirety, and I'll have more to say on an upcoming video. But I would say that Cozy Stickerville went too far in trying to be a activity over being a game. I think they didn't get the balance right. So for me, they went too far in that regard. And yet I think that Cozy Stickerville's existence is important because it proves that there's this appetite and desire for relaxing experiences on the table that have existed in video games now for like over a decade, with like Animal Crossing and Stardew Valley and Harvest Moon, and you know, like another board game example is like A Place for All My Books. Like there's clearly an appetite for this, and I think that it's good for the industry that these exist and that's being identified, so that people can be more ambitious in that space and innovate and do more with it, because they'll realize that the for lack of a better way to explain it, the money's there from a profitability standpoint. But I think that it went too far, and that's okay, I think.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, Cozy Stickerville definitely sounds like a good example. It's one I was intrigued by the concept of, but not enough to go out and seek myself, and I know you'll have more to say about it, but... okay, so I'm going to give a couple examples, and I'm just going to say right now, like, I'm sure there are much more egregious examples of these, and maybe I've just mostly avoided those because I've known that, or like I've suspected, them sort of going too far. But in a way, when I think back, like, Gloomhaven, in a way, is almost too far for me, personally, just in terms of me being the person to want to manage the game. So I know that I was, like, lucky enough to have you be the one setting the game up, managing all the monsters. You, like, pretty early on switched to using the app to manage like monster health and tracking the decks where you pull the critical cards from and like all that kind of stuff, or the modifier cards from. So I think if it was like, if someone asked me, hey, do you want to play a Gloomhaven campaign? Can you set it up and run it for us? Like, for me, I would say like, that's too much for me right now.
Yeah.
It wasn't too much for me to be able to play through it. And I also don't want this to sound negative because like we had such great memories playing it, but I'm just so thankful that you were, the one to take that on. And maybe it was a different level of excitement too about like our first big campaign game and like this dungeon crawl. Like, I don't know. It was something new for us at the time. Sorry, I guess before I move on, like, does Frosthaven feel like it's bordering on going too far for you these days, or is the difficulty with getting through the campaign just the typical campaign stuff that applies to every campaign game, just the idea of like having a consistent group meeting?
I think that, yeah, I would say that most campaign games you could argue have gone too far but it's real. That's going to be 100% dependent on the group and the person. Many of them are asking a lot of people, but games like Frosthaven, I think, are asking more of people than games like Seventh Continent. And I think that Frosthaven might be borderline or maybe over that line of asking for too much, and especially with all the upkeep you're doing that they've added in between the actual dungeon diving. But for another group, they might, always when they get together, start at 11 a.m. and go right until, midnight. And if that's the case, maybe you're not as bothered by how much time you're spending on each system, because it is meant to sort of be this all-encompassing thing. But I think maybe it's alienating more people who it's just going to be too much of a barrier for entry for them to consider, if that makes sense.
Right. So has it gone too far for you?
I think a little bit. I think that I appreciate a lot of what Frosthaven has done and added in, but I think that, like, if we say that Gloomhaven was a 50 out of 100 in terms of, like, for lack of a better system, like if we just said that was 50 out of 100 in terms of what it had for complexity of components and everything, and Frosthaven became an 80 or a 90, let's say, then I think maybe it went too far in the sense that it should have, like, aspired to be a 65 and just up it a bit, give me a little bit more, but still not add too much to it. Like, it added a lot. And as someone who, like, had to invest in storage solutions and things like that for Gloomhaven, I just didn't have that same desire for Frosthaven. I basically repurposed everything I could from Gloomhaven, and whatever didn't fit in that or I would have needed more for, I just went with whatever they gave me because I just couldn't invest anymore at that time. So I feel like, yeah, and also just the size of the box and everything, like it's great. Gives you lots and lots for your bang for your buck, but it is demanding of the players for sure.
Yeah, that's fair. Well, and speaking of demanding, like, the next one I want to talk about was Imperium Classics and Legends. I haven't played Imperium Horizons, which came out much more recently and has, from what I've heard, it's improved on a bunch of the issues that I had with Imperium Classics and Legends, so I won't get too into those. I did a review on the channel a few years ago, but it's basically like a deck building civilization game where there's a unique deck for every single civilization, and between the Classics and Legends boxes, I think there's like 18 different civilizations you can play as. And this is one of those ones where I felt like it went too far in terms of, like, between the setup time, the rules, the managing a bot. Like I talked about why I wouldn't want to play it with two players or more, why it was like solo only for me. But then there's too much with like managing the bot and having to flip back and forth between like the reference guide and seeing what each different faction does in certain situations. And that felt like it was too much for me, but it definitely pushed the boundaries of what like a deck building game can do. And there was a lot of cool stuff in there with like the history mechanic where you can like get cards that get tucked into your history so they're not clogging up your deck anymore, but they'll score points for you at the end. Like I'm barely scratching the surface of some of the stuff this game did, and that's one where I remember thinking like either if they made a digital version of this game or someone made a reimplementation. And I guess they did that Star Trek Captain's Chair one, but I'm not really interested in the Star Trek theme. I might give it a shot someday, but so yeah, that's one that definitely comes to mind. I know you haven't played those, but I'm sure you have similar games you've thought of that have that kind of solo barrier of like it's just too much stuff to manage.
For sure. I think that's like inherently almost going to be something that you're considering with almost like every solo game, because everyone's tolerance is different for how much it takes to like start playing, and also how much time you spend on your turn versus the AI or Automa's turns as well and stuff like that. So like there's 100% a lot to be said there, whether it's for Imperium or whether it's for any game playing solo, in terms of what you're willing to stomach as part of that experience.
Yeah. Okay, so and before we get into these categories, I just want to ask you, because there were two games that came to mind that I don't think they have gone too far, but I want to bring up Slay the Spire, the board game, and Dorfromantic, the board game. And I say that because they both have the board game in their official titles, just to be clear. But so I don't think they've gone too far, but when they were announced, I remember thinking like, is this going too far? Like, is this really necessary to be making a physical version of something that is already digital, something that's going to require more admin time, more setup, more fiddliness, like a big box with all these components? They might not be able to live up to certain, it's going to have certain limitations, like the limited tile set in Dorfromantic, whereas on PC you have the unlimited or the infinite tile count possibilities and et cetera, et cetera. But like, so again, I don't think those have gone too far, but even if I had, I would say like those are really helping pave the way for what it looks like to port a game over from a digital space into an analog one.
Yeah, like those two examples are two of the better ones you could have picked in terms of like, I don't think that they've gone too far, but I think that the idea, the concept, the genre of adapting video games to board games, there's tons of examples that have gone too far, and I think that as soon as it becomes just like a marketing strategy to be like, here's another way to expose players to this brand, to Dead Cells, to there's another one like Vampire Survivor, whatever it's called, is getting a board game. Like there's certain ones
Deep
where
Rock Galactic.
Yeah, like there's ones where it feels like I'm not saying they can't be translated into good board games. I'm saying that Slay the Spire and Dorfromantic, as soon as you hear they're being made, the first thought I have is, yeah, that makes sense. Like it already basically is that, and like sure it can. There's space for that to have a physical version, and then there's other ones where I think it's going too far when we just decide like, this is a really popular board game or video game, so now it needs a board game. It's like, well, does it though? Like, it's a really popular video game. Why not just continue to make it a really successful video game? Invest in that. Maybe it can be exclusive. Maybe it doesn't need a tabletop version. If the tabletop version isn't going to be better than the video game version, what's the compelling reason we need both? I guess would be my question.
I'm curious, and it's, there's a lot of these other ones that have been in the past couple of years. Like, I know there's the Witcher board game, there's Elder Scrolls, then more recently there's been like Valheim and Don't Starve, and like, I haven't played any of those, so.
Yeah.
All right, well, we'll leave it there and we'll move on. Maybe we'll circle back to those kinds of games some other day. But okay, so we're going to get into our actual categories here. So basically each of these, we're just going to say, if we can think of any specific game examples, or just say, where is that line? So when I talk about crossing that line, for each of these categories, we're going to say where that kind of line is for us individually, and if we can think of any specific game examples that have crossed that line. So let's start off with duration. So basically just the playtime of a game.
Yeah. So I purposely didn't pick my example or focus on this category in terms of like really long games, like for instance like Cloud Spire and stuff like that, where I'm like, oh, it's just like it went too far, because it absolutely did, but like I wanted to try to find one that was a little bit more compelling. And so the one I came up with from recent play was Taj Mahal. And for me, I think I'm realizing that with Knizia designs, like ones that are true, that's the wrong word, true Knizia designs, but like ones that feel like you would use it as an example to be like, this is what a Knizia game is like. You know, like you wouldn't necessarily give someone Siege of Rundar and be like, this is what it feels like to play a Knizia game. You'd give them like Through the Desert or Battle Line or whatever, and say like, you'll see a lot of through lines here in his design. And I feel like when it comes to those type of Knizia designs that we've come to expect, I don't think that I want it to be more than an hour. I feel like what I come for with those Knizia designs is a game that plays in under an hour and is super satisfying. And I'm saying, like, I say an hour, there's obviously like give and take. It could be an hour 5, it could be an hour 15, it could be 45 minutes, whatever. But I just mean that like Taj Mahal, we have to play more to see what we get it down to, but it already is advertising itself as a bit of a longer experience. And I think with our game groups, generally we do go longer than the time on the box for the majority of games. And I think that that's one where, you know, it's just ever so slightly too far in terms of duration for me. I think if I knew reliably that every time I played, it wasn't even going to be a question that we were going to go over an hour, an hour would always be the max, it would be like the perfect sweet spot for me. Whereas knowing that when I sit down to play that game, it might go an hour and a half, hour 45, right away my eyes are sort of drifting to other games and being like, well, but for that time we could do 2 of this, or we could do this game or whatever. So I think that's the example I came up with.
Okay, I like it. I didn't have as many maybe specific game examples. So I'm going to say there's sort of 2 different cutoff lines here for me. One would be sort of like if it's a spontaneous game night or a game day, like, so even if time allowed for it, but if people came over and just out of nowhere, someone said, hey, do you want to play this game? Where I didn't have any time to like mentally prepare for it or whatever. So I'll answer that one first. And I would say that is usually like, I would say around 3 or 3.5 hours. Sorry, longer than that, I would say, is probably where I would opt out almost. Like, I'm not saying that I would leave someone's house or say I don't want to play at all, but if someone like came over or I went to someone's place and they're like, hey, we're going to play this game, it's 4 hours straight up, like, you know, even first time it might take longer kind of thing. Like, I think once it gets longer than 3, I'm like really, really not that in. I can't think of many games at all that I've enjoyed that have taken significantly longer than 3 hours. I can tolerate 3 when it's a game I love that has run long, maybe because there's new players playing. Like, I've had games of Agricola and Keyflower and stuff like that in the past go 3 hours. Like, there have been other games like that where I'm like, it's okay. Or even A Feast for Odin, which I don't love, but I like it quite a bit. Those I can tolerate from time to time. But yeah, if someone's trying to sell me on a game that's going to be 3.5 hours or longer, that's where I'm like, I just would rather not play, I think.
No, I was going to say, I honestly can't remember the last time I played a game that was over 3.5 hours willingly without someone else sort of pushing for it, especially one that I hadn't played before. And I think I would be a harder sell for me too. Like, it would have to be something I'm either really excited for that I'm the one putting it forward, or it's like a campaign game or something where like it's not really a question, you just sort of accept that. Yeah,
I think Station Fall was probably the longest game we've played together in the past like few months.
Yeah.
And that's the sort of thing where like, yeah, we planned it in advance and had to get sort of like mentally in that. Like, if I just showed up at someone's house and they're like, we're going to play Station Fall tonight, and I had expected to play like some tile laying games or something, I might be kind of like, I might feel my anxiety go up a little bit, just as like, who am I going to enjoy the next few hours here? Like, I don't know if this is really what I signed up for.
Yeah, totally.
But if I had enough time in advance, I'd say the cutoff is more in the like probably 6 hour, like, I guess we're getting into that almost Twilight Imperium or 18XX range where like I'm intrigued by these games, and if someone could promise me like maybe 6 hours as the cap, maybe 8, think of it as like a full day's work, and if I knew like a few weeks in advance, maybe I could allow for that. But yeah, I don't know. I think generally the sweet spot for me is already like, you know, hour and a half kind of range. So even making the exception to 3 hours feels like a lot. But so now let's talk setup time. And you could also factor this into the playtime of the game itself. Do you want me to go first on this one?
Sure. Yeah, take it away.
Okay. So For me, it's relative to the playtime and the overall enjoyment of the game. I don't think of it as strictly a ratio of like, if setup takes more than half the time that the game takes to play, then it's not worth it, because if it's a really, really fun 10 or 15 minute game, like I don't mind if it takes a similar amount of time to set up or whatever. And generally, if it's something that I can be setting up on my own at home while I have like a podcast or listening to music in the background, generally I don't mind a little bit of setup time. I would just say once it starts to get longer than 20 minutes, I get annoyed, but I'm still like okay with it. I would say the cutoff for me would probably be if I'm unable to set up a game within 30 minutes after I've already played it once or twice, like I know what I'm doing, I know what the components are, I can identify things. If it still takes me more than 30 minutes, I think that's where I would just say there's almost no way it's going to be worth it.
That's fair. I think for me, I would almost put this into two buckets. If I'm setting up a game in advance for people coming over, I don't really think that there's any setup time that would bother me if the game is something I enjoy. If we're talking like, I like a game as much as Keyflower, and it's every time I have to set it up, it's 40 minutes, but it's always something that I'm having set up. Yeah, there's going to be a part of that I'm like, oh, I wish this was quicker to set up. But ultimately, if I'm setting up in advance, I enjoy that process. It's never really going to be a holdup for me ever. And that's coming from someone who I spent like you said, like every time I was setting up Gloomhaven was probably like 30 minutes, especially with like the computer being set up and all that kind of stuff. But if we're talking about games being set up with other players present, like my tolerance goes way down. I'm never gonna finish a first game with people, even if it's like we finish the first game and it's 8:00 and everyone's staying until 1 a.m. and then they're like, why don't we play Feast for Odin? I love a Feast for Odin. I don't want to just sit there and set it up for half an hour while or have everyone be like, what can I help with? And I'm like, there's like so many bags of components. Like my tolerance goes way down if it were talking about setting up a game live with other people there.
Okay, I agree with you. The tolerance is way higher if I'm the host and I'm the first, like, setting it up on my own. But let me ask you, if you were hosting, setting the game up on your own, what would be the cutoff for Keyflower? Like, I know it's a ridiculous prospect to say that, like, Keyflower could take, like, an hour and a half to set up. Like, there's not that many components. But I'm just saying, like, would there be a point where you're like, okay, this is ridiculous? Like, where would the cutoff be?
I mean, I'm sure like, yeah, like if I'm spending an hour to set up a game every time, I guess the thing for me is like, I can't even think of a game that would take me that's ever taken me that long to set up. So like, if I'm like realistically, the longest I can think that it's ever taken me to set up a game, I would still be fine with that. Like, like right now, like if I had to think what the longest it's taken to set up a game, like I think Cloudspire would be up there, but you set up most of that. There was only one time I set it up, and there's probably others in that same length. And those being the longest that it's ever taken me to set up a game, I'd still be fine with that if I was setting it up in advance. I usually enjoy that process, unless it's a game that I'm not excited to play or I don't enjoy. Then that changes things for sure.
Okay, yeah, that's fair. All right, let's move on to rules and complexity. We're also going to kind of try to squeeze in mechanics into this as well, but let's start with just kind of rules and complexity. So why don't you go first on this one? Yeah,
like for my tolerance for complexity is high. Like for sure you can catch me on different days and there's going to be different states of mind that I'm in, but I would say that it would have I will play a 4.6 complexity game if it sounds compelling, sounds interesting, and I will watch rules videos in advance and I will be like ready to learn on the day. But if it changes things when you're factoring in like how long it takes for those rules to teach. So like separating complexity and rules, like if I'm going to a game night and I know it's going to be an hour and a half to do the rules teach for all four of us at the table, it's not, to be honest, it's not often I'm going to be, I'll do it, but and sometimes I'll do it because I really want to play that game, but I'm never going to always enjoy the process of knowing like I'm sitting down and I'm not actually going to play this game for an hour and a half and we're just starting that process. That never feels completely great. So like the only example I brought, it was just like one that we've talked about recently, which is like fresh fish, for instance. Like for instance, like for me, that is an example of it's gone too far in terms of the obtuseness complexity of it, that even if there's a good game under there, the fact that this game is always going to have this be a thing where if someone forgets certain things, that we'll have to remind everyone, or someone hasn't played before, we're going to have to get over that hurdle again. It almost doesn't, there could be a Keyflower game under there for me, and that's a level of complexity that I know is just always going to be a barrier every time I take it out, especially if there's new people, or especially if they haven't played in 6 months. To me, it just becomes a thing where it's just, now the game's always going to struggle to get played in a really enjoyable, meaningful way. So that's like an example of like a game can be too complex for me to think that it belongs, not belongs in my collection, but that it's going to get enough love or play in my collection.
But do you think that one, for just to go to the Fresh Fish example specifically, that one wasn't bad enough? Like, from what you've said before, you're open to trying it again, right? It didn't go too far to the point where you went like, I'm completely writing this off and I've lost all hope.
No, like I wouldn't say I've lost hope. Like, I would play it again, but I truthfully don't think there's anything that, there's no level of good that Fresh Fish could be that will make me change my mind. I would say that it's too obtuse, complex of a system. It's that it is demanding something, especially of new players, especially of players who haven't played it in a certain amount of time, that the prospect of every time we take that out, having to remind everyone or get people to understand the system just doesn't make up for the fact that the answer to me is that this design is too complex / obtuse and not elegant enough, and that it basically needs to, in my head, like go back into the kitchen, into the cooking stage of it, and be designed, have different things changed to alleviate those concerns, right? And so for me, it goes too far to be able to have me ultimately enjoy it.
That's fair. But what about this alternate reality where 5 years from now, we have a group of 4 or 5 people in our circle who never needed to be reminded of the rules, and we end up really liking Fresh Fish? Then will it have gone too far?
I mean,
if it's this unique game that like now we're getting this super unique decision space that doesn't come out of any other game, and this really interesting auction, whatever, like if we were able to get to that, would you still feel it was too far for...
I'll respond to what you just asked me with a question. Do you think that, like realistically, do you think there's a world in the next 5 years that us and 4 people will play Fresh Fish regularly enough to never have that issue, when we still say we don't play games like Keyflower, Modern Art, Agricola, Feast for Odin enough every year? Do you think there's a world in the next 5 years we will actually be playing it regularly enough that won't be an issue?
Yes, I do. I don't know if he'll be part of that 4 or 5. I don't know if he'll be part of that 4 or 5.
I will say, and this isn't a challenge, I will say that just going about our board game ways and like how the next 5 years go, I will say I don't think that for either of us that will become a thing, because, and I'm only using that based on the data that we have right now, which is that we could probably each name like 20 games in our collections that we don't play enough. And I could easily name 20 games ahead of Fresh Fish that deserve to be played more. And until like, you know, something drastically changes in our lives to all of a sudden free up a bunch more time, I just don't think that it's ever going to be the one that is sort of getting enough dedicated to it, because it's not just you or me. Like if we identify that it's best of 4, we also have to find 2 other people who also have the time to play it regularly and to want to play it over other games. And I just feel like that becomes a harder thing to ask.
Yeah, no, that's fair. Yeah. All right, I'll leave the Fresh Fish for now. We'll come back to that some other. Okay, so, and yeah, for me, like on its own, it's really tough to pinpoint that line for rules and complexity, because I've also, like you brought up Cloudspire, which I've played Lisboa, I've played John Company 2nd Edition. These are among the heaviest games I've probably played, and I know there are still like much heavier games out there that I've not played. I think if a game is extremely rules heavy, as long as the game is not too long, or it hopefully has a theme that makes it easier to kind of make sense of the rules, I'm a lot more open to it. So let's say a game like Vinhos, about winemaking in Portugal. Mm. If you just point, like before explaining the rules, if someone just pointed to the board and said like, okay, here's the spot where you know, get your grapes. Like, here's where you have your wine cellar. Here's where you have the fair, the market. Here's where you can go to the bank, whatever. Like, if someone just pointed to the things on there, you could probably intuit an order of things you have to do in the game just because of the theme, right? So you're automatically making the game easier to learn because you're like, well, obviously I need to get the grapes first. I need to actually like make the wine. You know, I can age the wine in my cellar clearly. Obviously I'm going to want to sell it later. Like, those things are just naturally built into the theme. Whereas when a game goes into some completely fantastical theme, like I think of a game like even Bitoku, when we were learning that, it's probably less complex, like fewer rules than Venuge, but just felt harder to learn because it's like nothing on there. You don't look at this track and say, oh, well, in real life, this is how this thing would work. So it just, I don't know, I think a big part of it comes down to the theme a lot of the time.
Yeah, agreed.
And just how intuitive something can feel. And even just going back to Cloudspire, those movement rules were so unintuitive, and that's where it felt like it's an exercise in recalling memory, just remembering the step-by-step process of how these enemies move rather than any like type of real life, you know, theme actually helping inform me in any way.
Right. Yeah, I agree.
And so before we move on, like I kind of waited to bring up Twilight Imperium here. We didn't talk about it in the playtime and the setup time and all that kind of stuff because the prospect of Twilight Imperium is intriguing to me, but I think it's the combination of the rules plus the time combined that make me skeptical. If it was like the amount of rules it has, but it was 3 or 4 hours, maybe I would have made more of an effort to try something like Twilight Imperium by now. But I think it's the complexity with the playtime all factoring in together that makes something like that feel like it's too far for me.
Yeah, like that's an interesting one because it's too far for me too. But if we were just saying, is it too far for it to be a game that you play once a year during the Christmas holidays when this other group is saying doing their yearly Twilight Imperium game and I get in on that, is that too far? Then no. Like then I to be honest, that's the ideal situation for me, is that I play Twilight Imperium once a year, like with the same group at a certain thing when certain people are in town or whatever, and we do a full thing and it's an entire day thing, and I just like, I know I have to come in having refreshed myself on what I may have forgotten each time, and I get better each year in remembering. Maybe it goes to twice a year, one time because people come back in the summer, whatever. That to me isn't too far. But if it's too far for me for a game that I'm going to own in my collection and be scheduling my own game nights for, because there's just, yeah, it's just asking too much of me and of the people that I'd be bringing in to that session.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, let's move on to mechanics. So is there a game or is there a point when a game can feel like it has one too many mechanics, too many things going on, whether it's just the way it's listed on the BGG page? I mean, this kind of can bleed over a little bit into rules as well. And I guess I'll go first on this one. The first game that came to mind, and again, probably more egregious examples, but I had to pick Dwellings of Eldervale for this. And it's not specifically mechanics. It's part of it is like theme, and I just put in point form some of the things this game has. Okay, dragons, miniatures, adventure cards, orbs, mercenaries, magic cards, slots for treasure tokens, spells, prophecy cards. There's dice combat. There's worker placement, you have area majority, you have rune tiles, there's wizards and warriors, and you have your tableau of cards that you can build out. You have the actual dwellings, there are auras, there are sword icons that you can contribute to battles, there's a glory track, there's an underworld, there's elemental power tracks, etc. Like it's been, I think, almost 2 years now since we've played the game, so I'm going mostly off of memory and a quick scan of the rulebook here to remind myself. But I remember we had a good laugh about this when we were playing it. And this isn't like it's not a bad game by any means, but it felt a bit like a first draft to me where someone said, I'm just going to get all the ideas on paper and then we'll worry about the editing later. And it felt like the game was fun enough after that first draft that I wonder if this wasn't the first draft, which it probably wasn't. Like, it's not right of me to assume that this was actually a rushed first draft or something that underwent no development. But like, what was cut from this game?
Yeah. Yeah, it's been, I won't speak to, like, I agree with you, but I won't speak specifically to it because it's just been too long for me to fully remember. But even just as you name those off, I remember us having joked about it, and I remember it feeling like a lot, and it's like almost it feels like it's trying to do all the things that people like and all the buzzwords and all the aspects so that it sort of brings in everybody. And like the most recent example I can think of was because we played Newsfjord. It made me realize that I think that I can identify that in terms of mechanics, like resources, things to consider, Agricola, for instance, goes too far for me, but only because in that theme and in that sort of world that we're operating in, that many things to consider and to manage was one too far. Whereas Newsfjord, I know it's a slightly different theme, but I would say my engagement with the theme is the same. I feel the same way about fishing in a Norwegian village that I do about farming in Agricola or whatever, in terms of my engagement with it. Newsfjord was like, it's not the ceiling for me, but it's the balance better. I feel like my tolerance, my gone too far, is somewhere between Newsfjord and Agricola, and I think it's just that, like, that's why I know we've joked before about like how I feel about feeding families in Agricola, but then and how in other games I'm okay with it, and I think it's because in Agricola it almost feels like one too many things that I'm having to think about. It's like while I'm having fun enjoying all these other systems, there's this other thing that keeps like nagging me, being like, well, you have to feed your family, and it's like if that had one less thing or two less things or whatever, maybe that wouldn't bother me as much, but because I'm engaging with all these other things, it's the one thing that's too much for me. And so I think it's just more of an example that like that tolerance is going to be different for everybody. But for me, it also comes down to what you said about the theme. If Lacerda makes a game that's about filmmaking in the golden age of Hollywood, and as soon as I go into it, I know, oh yeah, you do this, and then you have to hire your actors, and then you got like after casting's done, then you're going to production here. Like that's easier for me to wrap my head around, and I'm okay with there being one too many mechanics because it doesn't feel like too many because they're already sort of present in my mind, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would just say, first off, I don't appreciate you taking another shot at Agricola. I feel like there's been enough on the channel recently.
That wasn't a shot. That was just that was just perspective.
The reason why I say that is just because I think in Agricola you might feel that way more because of the impact that the cards have, along with like the feeding requirements, rather than maybe the mechanisms. Only because I would argue that both A Feast for Odin and Hallertau have more mechanics going on than Agricola. Like when I think about Hallertau and the way that the fallow fields and the way that sheep work, and you have the community center that moves over and the card system, like I feel like that one has more mechanics than something like Agricola.
A Feast for Odin definitely does. Hallertau, I wouldn't have said so, but it's also been a while since I played Hallertau, so to be fair, I'd have to play that recently again to be able to compare. But yeah, I think the difference is Feast for Odin absolutely does, but Feast for Odin also gives you more openness in the sense that like you don't have to necessarily engage with all of them, and I know that that's probably the case too in Agricola, but I guess there's more that feels necessary to engage with in Agricola because everything has these scores tied to it at the end, where like if you haven't collected at least one of this, you're going to score -1 or 0, whatever it is, versus if you've sort of gone into everything, and then especially with like whether or not you feed your family and the negative points you get from that and everything. Whereas in Feast for Odin, there's certain things on the board that if you don't put pieces down onto, you will get negative. But that to me is like, even though there's many ways to accomplish filling that board, but it's like one thing you're engaging with in the way I approach a board game. It's like I'm engaging with this board that I have to cover up negatives, and I have multiple ways to go about that, but I'm covering up negatives. And I guess in Agricola it feels like the amount of resources I'm tracking and the amount of things I'm managing, the cards, feeding my family, upgrading my houses, all this stuff, it's like one too many things for me, whereas Newsfjord felt like it was closer to that balance. And I can take more, but it was like I want something almost like right in the middle of those is my ceiling.
For sure, yeah. And no question, like Newsfjord is definitely a simpler game than Agricola, and I still love it as well. But and you're absolutely right, like the different pressures of Agricola are felt pretty heavily, so...
Yeah.
Okay, now let's move on to decisions in games. So when has a game gone too far in terms of the maybe number of decisions that it can give you?
Honestly, this one's pretty similar to like I don't have a specific example for this one. It's more just I don't mind analysis paralysis. Rarely feels like a problem for me because I just always sort of default to I have like I have like an internal clock that like if I'm taking too long or if I feel like, when I say taking too long, I don't mean for the people around the table. I mean for me and my comfort level. If I get to a certain point where I feel like I have been thinking too long about this, I just make a decision. And I never bothers me that I had to make a decision without thinking things through. I just sort of roll with that. So decisions don't weigh on me the same way. I would say that for a game to go too far in decisions, I have to like really feel like not only am I not able to figure out what's optimal, I'm not able to figure out like what even makes sense. Like there's so many that I don't even know, like I can't even seem to find a way to tie it to the theme, being like, okay, like this is supposed to happen before this. Like, yeah, I'm struggling to even figure that out. Then it feels like too many. Beyond that, it's the only thing that's going to make me feel too like it's gone too far with the amount of decisions it presents me with is if none of them are compelling. If none of them are interesting or fun to really engage with, it really gone too far could be 3 decisions because all of them are boring to me, and it starts to feel like this game went too far because I could have dealt with 1 boring decision, but you've given me 3 boring ones and you've just taken it too far in that regard.
Yeah, I agree with that. For me, I don't have a ton to say on this one either. I would say the main thing is games that are too much in the point salad feel, where there's a lot of different options that only have very slight variations or sometimes no variation. So like if on my turn I'm looking around the board and I can see like maybe there's 20 or 30 or 40 different things I could do. And if I look at one, it's like, okay, did I do this? Okay, that would get me 3 points. Okay, what if I go here? Okay, that would get me 4 points or whatever. And if I'm sitting there comparing and it's like, I go through option after option after option, and maybe after like 10 options, the variation is like between 3 and 5 points. And if a winning score is like 200, like, is this really... Like, is the game going to be decided by a couple of points? Is it really that impactful that I'm looking at all of these different decisions? At that point, I'd rather there only be 3 or 4 options on my turn and be able to realize that, like, hey, these are all pretty much the same. Let's pick something and move on. I think increasing options is only really good when the options are significantly different from each other. Yeah. Or when it creates a difficult puzzle to find that clever move, like something like Winter Kingdom. Even more to a more extent than Kingdom Builder, like Winter Kingdom, you could probably sometimes on certain turns find thousands of permutations of what you could possibly do in what order. And that makes it feel like more than any other games that I love. That's one of the ones that makes my head spin the most. But when you find one of those clever moves where you're moving all across the map and popping up at different spots to meet these scoring conditions, like sometimes it can feel so rewarding to be that clever. So that's one that gets close. The one game I'm going to call out for this is the Voyages of Marco Polo 2. So the first Voyages of Marco Polo is known for being very, very tight. You don't have enough actions to accomplish what you want. There's not many spaces to get the different resources. So if you want to get, like, let's say pepper or whatever, there's maybe only 1 or 2 places you can go to acquire it. So it's really tough to get what you need. Whereas the Voyages of Marco Polo 2, they didn't change the game enough, but what they did was they opened it up. Then they included a bunch of different ways. Like it's just much more open. So anything that you want, you can probably achieve anything you want to do. It's just a matter of where do you achieve it on the board. There might be 6 or 7 different places to get that one resource that you're short on. And it's just a matter of looking around and saying, like, which option do I want to take to acquire that resource? And that's where I find it gets less interesting, because it's just that's where a lot of it comes down to pure efficiency. It's just like, where am I getting the best deal? And that's where it again comes down to these minuscule calculations of trying to figure out where you can save one resource or save $1 or an action or whatever. Okay, now let's move on to genre. So like a type of game. I'll say right now, I don't have anything for this one. There's none that I can think of here off the top of my head where like a style of game would be a complete deal breaker. Even games that I don't seek out myself, a lot of them I'm open to at least playing. I mean, maybe there's something if I thought long and hard enough about it, but what about you?
I'm just going to throw out 2 that haven't gone too far yet, but I would say that will be the ones that could most get close or have gotten close, and that is legacy games. I think that legacy games are borderline at times, always getting to the point of going too far. And I mean that in the sense that like the amount of legacy games that exist and how many things are getting legacy treatment. I think that I think this all just spurs from the fact that some games invoked the legacy feel and it was very novel and unique, and so every game decided to try to do a version of that because it was an easy way to say, we have this popular game, now we don't have to think of a new way to bring it out. We can just come up with a legacy version. And I'm not saying that inherently makes them bad. I'm just saying that not every game that has had a legacy version absolutely needed it. And so that genre has gotten to the point of going too far for me. It doesn't mean I'll completely write off legacy games. It just means that now I'm always questioning it. Like Mountain Goat's Legacy could be amazing and it could absolutely need to have that and exist in that form. But it's hard not for my eyes to roll as soon as I hear it, because I just think that like it's missing the point of what legacy games are supposed to be in the first place. But again, that's it's not in general going too far, because I'll still always consider them, so.
Yeah. The only thing I can really add to this would be, in terms of legacy games, would be when it's like a single use play and it's a lot of components and has a high environmental impact. That's where I also would sort of draw the line for myself. If you're spending, $100 on this game, you're going to play it once and it's a massive box and you can never replay it, and then it's just going to go in a landfill, then it's hard. Like, this is its own topic again of like, then where do you draw the line? Like, how much enjoyment is worth it? If you played it for 3 years every single weekend, then is it worth the environmental impact and the time you spent? Whereas if you played it over a couple weekends and you were done in the span of 5 hours and you spent 200, like maybe then it was like, it's hard to say. So that's a whole other thing, but that's the only thing I can really add to legacy games there. All right, now what about price?
Price for me is, all I'll say is that in general, as soon as a board game is like $150, I would say that it's not that it always will have gone too far, but right away I need some sort of justification for why I'm spending that much and what I'm getting in return. I don't mean like tangibly like what the price of what I'm getting in return is. I just mean like the experience, the fun, the enjoyment, the game, the amount of plays I'm going to get. I have questions because it's a hard sell when there's so many games that are excellent at $40, $50, $60. For you to say that a game's gonna be 3 times that price, it needs to justify that to me as soon as it hits that $150 mark. And yeah, you know what? I'll just leave it there because I feel like that's pretty much better encapsulates what I'm feeling. It won't always be a write-off for me, but it now all of a sudden becomes a question mark for me.
Okay. Yeah, for me, I think if it's for like a, let's say, and by the way, I should say right now for anyone who's unclear, like we're in Canada, so we're talking Canadian dollars here. But for me, for a standard game, I would say I would not want to pay any more than $100. I think Bus, which we talked about, we got around that price, like less than that. Dave has a good price at it there at Victory Pines, but like a lot of places it's listed around $100, but it's not like, there's not a bunch of extra, there's no like mini expansion built in. It's not like a game that has a ton of extra cards for variability or some other things. Like that game we know is as expensive as it is because it was out of print for so long and you're sort of paying that like splotter tax, for lack of a better term, because these games are typically made in Netherlands. So that's something where like if Bus was 150 or even 120, 130, I probably wouldn't have bought it. And if another game that's, again, isn't like some big box Kickstarter with a bunch of extra stuff in it or whatever, were to exceed $100, I'd probably be expecting a level of quality similar to Bus, where like this better be some masterpiece that is like, I have no regrets on paying that. There's very few games I've spent more than $100 on. A few come to mind, like Rise and Fall, Guards of Atlantis 2, Trick Shot, etc. But these are all like deluxeified games where like I could see where the extra cost or the dollars went in. So even though in some of those cases it feels wrong, like it'll be a while before I'm able to get my money's worth on those, but I at least know like to some degrees those have varying degrees of like resale value and that kind of thing. So even if I don't decide to keep them, I make a bit more of an exception for games like that on occasion. Okay, now let's talk about components. So this is kind of referring to things being potentially overproduced. So I'll say it's a little bit of a gray area. I mean, I think it depends on how often you expect a game to get played, as well as like the price point, the weight and complexity level of the game. So I'm going to give a couple of almost different extremes in terms of like philosophies, in terms of like publishing companies out there. So CMYK, maybe not opposite philosophies, but just in terms of like the price point stuff. So CMYK is a publisher I like a lot. They did Hot Streak, Wavelength, lots of other games. And so like I love a lot of their games. I love the table presence. We talked about Lacuna as well, like super unique stuff, even just the packaging, the boxes these come in, whatever. But the price on their games is usually very high because of how high quality the components are, and especially for light games. Like Hot Streak is a party game that's like $54. Like Wavelength is another party game that doesn't even have the miniature figures. It has that dial. It's like, I think $40 or $45. So these are games where, and even when we talk about some of these like Fruit Fight and those Magenta line games, their version of No Thanks, I believe, is like $35, whereas the original version of No Thanks was, I think, like 15 or 20. So that's where they haven't quite crossed the line for me, but they're almost right on that line where like you're kind of getting away with as much money as you're going to get from me for these style of games, I think. Before I comment on any others, like how do you feel about CMYK, for example, and like the higher price point for like party or light games?
Yeah, I agree with you. I just think that's again, it's going to come down to people's personal preference and tolerance. But I just feel like to take a game that was priced accessibly to be able to play in party settings and to create a version of it that ups all the component quality to make that game a certain price point, it just like, to what end would, I guess, be my question. Like how many people that, I mean, I guess it depends. Like if you're constantly impressing and people are leaving with such good impressions because in these party settings, you're now playing this higher production quality game, maybe that is worth it. And maybe it's more a testament to how you feel about the people that you're playing that party game with, that you're like, these people, not these people deserve the best, but you know what I mean? Like you're willing to invest in this game because of the people you're playing with and the level of use it's going to get. But it's a hard sell when you can then say, I'm going to go get No Thanks for this price that's like, $15 or $10 or whatever it is versus, tripling the price. Is it worth it? Yeah, like I think I'm right there with you.
Yeah. So there's two companies that I'm going to highlight real quick. One being Chip Theory Games, which has they're known for kind of like the poker chip style components, neoprene mats, everything being waterproof, etc. I think that you're getting a sort of deluxified. These are like big game experiences. I'm also going to put Ivy Studio into the mix. Games like Moonrakers and Veiled Fate that have like extremely high production value. For me, these again are on the border, but at the more expensive price points where like, for me, I wouldn't want to spend that kind of money on a game like Veiled Fate or Moonrakers, but for people who like, if you love that game, then like the component quality is like out of control. Like it's super, super nice. So it just, again, a lot of that comes down to like, how often are you going to play the game? How much do you love it? What's the price point? It kind of all factors in, I think, to whether a game has gone too far when it comes to components.
Yeah. And so for me, for components, I would say, I can almost say that most games that have miniatures have gone too far. And that's for me because I don't paint miniatures. So I feel like I'm losing out on the bit. Like, to put it in perspective, like any game that I get with miniatures, I'm always, unless someone paints them for me, which a friend of mine, Corbin, wants to paint my miniatures, which is going to be great. But in general, I'm always going to be looking at these gray unpainted miniatures. And so when I'm not getting the intended use out of them. And especially if it's a game, like we've talked about Castle of Burgundy, the special edition, like games that introduce miniatures and introduce components to that quality that are purely eye candy and aren't necessary. It's like Evertree and Everdell and stuff like that. Like those, to me, it's always going, not always, that's the wrong word, but often it's going too far. If all you're doing is saying for the sake of it, we've added all these, 3D components. I think that if like there's going to be an application for that for people who play that game a whole ton and they want it to be beautified and get the best experience. But if it's also going to increase my setup time, my fiddliness, if it's going to add all this, weight to the box, like it just ends up making it less accessible to play and for me. And so that ends up having to go too far, look at the components in Rebirth, the castles and everything. And my question would be, why did Castles of Burgundy, for instance, that special edition, need all these huge 3D components? I would have much rather have just paid for a version that gave me like little castles like in Rebirth or whatever, and not added to the box size, not added to the fiddliness, not added to the complexity, etc. But again, that's me, because I also don't do miniature painting, so I'm not really the target audience for those.
Yeah, gotcha. Okay, now let's talk about player elimination real quick. We don't have to spend a lot of time on this. We don't play a lot of games with player elimination. Where do you stand? When has it gone too far?
I would say the only time a player elimination goes too far for me is if it eliminates players early. I think if a player gets eliminated from a game early and then they're expected to even sit around watching for like 15 minutes, 20 minutes, I think that's getting to the point of it's unfair to that player, right? And so as soon as it's unfair to one person at the gaming group, then imagine that from the perspective of they come over to play board games and they find out that now the next 20 minutes I'm just watching, right? Like it becomes, to me, it's gone too far. So I feel like if player elimination happens at the end of the game, like challengers, always fine. If it happens at the beginning of the game, almost always not okay for me.
Yeah, I think in general I'm not a big fan of it, but it's especially if it's a really long game. If it's something short, someone's just out of the round, waits 5-10 minutes here or there, whatever. But I don't think I've played a game with serious degrees of player elimination in probably like 20 plus years now. All the ones I've played have been like you're out, maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes before the end, which is not, if you're playing a 3-hour game and people at least know what they're getting into beforehand, I think that's the most important thing there. Okay, social implications, second last category here. So I will say, if I'm playing with like my wife, my closest friends, family, etc., I think it's pretty much all good. I can't really think of games that have gone too far for me. The games that I've played, at least, or that are accessible to me. With people I don't know well, or maybe I'm doing, like, if I'm being asked to do something ridiculous in a public setting, I think that's where socially I would feel like the game has pushed me a little bit too far. Like, well, I'll bring up the example when we played Blood on the Clock Tower with like 14 people at Kilter Brewing a couple of years ago. Meeting more than half those people for the first time, you're trying to be friendly, but also like you're playing to win the game to an extent, obviously, and try not to. You have to be secretive and alliances and backstabbing and all this kind of stuff. And there's people you don't know. That was almost like a bit below the cutoff of what I would have felt like. Like, I don't want to give the wrong impression because it wasn't too much. I had a great time, but those are experiences that I need to have only once in a while. And I felt like if it had been maybe like 20 people or the stakes felt higher or something, it might have felt maybe like it was too far for me. I would say, to give an example of something that would be too far, would be if a game like Monikers, if I was being asked to play Monikers on like a live stage in front of like a live audience or something like that, that would probably feel too far because I'd find it hard to get too far out of my like comfort zone with some of like the acting and stuff like that for a game like Monikers. Or a game like True Colors, where you have to call people out for, a game. It's basically a game where it says like, who in your group is the most likely to do this, and like who's the most likely to get into a car crash, or who's the most likely, and like this could lead to you calling people out on things that could lead to some pretty hurt feelings. I think playing something like that with either like coworkers or acquaintances or people I don't know super well and have never had like a tough conversation with, I think that might be something a little too far as well in terms of social implications. What do you think?
Yeah, I don't have a ton to add to that. Really, all I would say is they don't ever go too far for me when I'm playing with people that I know. But if I'm playing with acquaintances and strangers, they almost always go too far for me. I'm talking like games like Monikers or One Night Ultimate Werewolf, things like that. If I'm playing with people I don't know, it's almost always too far for me, just with my own social anxieties and stuff. Whereas if I'm playing with my regular friends, gaming groups, or even just like one person I don't know but a bunch of people I do know, then it's rare that they ever go too far.
All right, in our final category, ethical reasons. So there could be a few things we touch on here. Dylan, I'm going to kick it over to you first.
Sure. I'm going to keep this as short as I possibly can and just say if you want any more insight right now into how I feel about this topic, subscribe to our Patreon. You can listen to me talk about it some more in the bonus episode from us talking about expanding on last week's. But I would say it will always be too far for me if you have included AI generative art in your board game. For whatever purpose you are just making that decision, often it is for profits or for price considerations. If that is the decision you have made, whatever is behind it, you've gone too far in service of that rationale, that reasoning. I think that the last thing I'll add to it for right now, until we talk about this in a bigger way one day, is I think that people who are choosing to use generative AI in any creative field right now, especially when it is done in a way that is replacing a human touch on it, I don't think you fully understand why people are upset by your willingness to do that. And I think it's because you haven't fully grasped the impact that it's going to have on creative society over the next 5 to 10 years, or even sooner. I think that is where you're facilitating and helping to create a less creative and artistic world. And that might sound like it's dramatic, but I think that if we had, like, say 2 hours to sit here and debate, I think I could make a pretty compelling case for that. And I think that a lot of people could. And I think but the question I would always ask is, take money, 100% of it. Imagine AI is not profitable. Imagine AI does not give you more profits, more money. Just coming down to the development and what AI art is, for instance. Do you want to live in a world surrounded by AI art, or do you want to live in a world surrounded by human art? Out of those two things. And if your answer is, I would much rather be around human art, then my question would be, why contribute to minimizing human art?
Yep, I agree entirely. I don't have a lot to add here, just because obviously we're nearing the end of a relatively long episode, and we did touch on this on our expansion bonus episode as well. I know we'll come back to this again, but I agree with you 100%. Robbing games of their charm and just making things look a lot more similar and a lot less distinct across the industry, which just, yeah, it hurts gaming as a whole with art. It's not just the individual games that have that art, but the industry as a whole, by also putting people out of work. And yeah, there's too many ramifications really to go over here.
Yeah, it hurts creativity as a whole.
Yeah. Before we move on to another topic, actually, I just want to piggyback off of this in terms of art. Just while we're on the topic of art, aside from AI, I would say art that promotes hurtful stereotypes or like inaccurate or outdated stereotypes, things like that, whether it's, marginalizing minorities or whatever the case may be. You can look at an example, like look at the game Ace of Spades on Board Game Geek, and you can look up the issues they came up with their card that I can't remember if it was a slave or slavery card or something like that. I'm not going to get into it here. You can go read up about it on Board Game Geek if you'd like, but that's definitely going way too far, and a credit to the publishing company of that specific game for doing their part to try to make things right. Another one I would say is just over-sexualizing women, just like ridiculously massive body proportions, revealing clothing or no clothing at all, or like games where it's like a battle game but this woman is in a bikini. It's like, why are you fighting someone in a bikini? This doesn't make any sense. Like, that kind of stuff is just, to me, is always going to feel like it's gone too far, especially because like we know better by now, and we've seen a lot of it improve in video games and board games, and it continues to be surprising to me when new games lean into that so heavily. And maybe surprising is the wrong word. Like, it's disappointing. I don't know if it is really surprising, I guess.
Yeah, totally. 100% agree. And it's especially weird if, like, I don't have an exact example, but like I've seen it all over the place where like you like are going into like combat, and it can be men or women, but like you're going into combat and you have someone like barely wearing any armor whatsoever just for the sake of like revealing skin. And it's like, right, so you're just going to die quicker. Like, where you've completely, not only is this kind of weird, you've taken me right out of the theme, because this would just never happen.
Exactly. So one game I want to highlight specifically is, and the reason, like, there's games that have been a lot worse for this kind of thing, but I'm going to bring up this game because we live in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and there was a game released some time ago called Manitoba. So I'm going to pull up the info right here so I don't get this wrong here. So it was released in 2018, co-designed by Remo Consadori and Marco Pranzo, published by DLP Games. We live in the province of Manitoba here in Canada, and there's a couple pretty bad things in this rulebook. One is, and the cover of the game and everything, but right in the rulebook it says, quote, "This game is set in the Canadian province of Manitoba with its green hills and majestic mountains, large lakes, endless prairies and forests." End quote. So if you live in Canada, if you live in Manitoba especially, you're probably asking, what majestic mountains? It's about as flat as it gets around here, right? Like, what majestic mountains? Seriously, seems like there was zero research to go into that. But that's fine. I could look past that. Whatever. It's kind of funny. But then if you look into the cover art a little more and you start asking yourself some questions, and if you know about Canada and different, Indigenous cultures and such, there's a good BGG thread called Cover Art Confusion. If you just sort by highest ranked threads, you'll find it right there. But basically the game is saying that players represent different clans of the Cree Indians, okay? But they've taken a bunch of things from other Indigenous cultures that are not actually present in Manitoba, and they've just kind of like mashed them together under the assumption that it's kind of just like, oh, it's all the same culture kind of thing. So like they have a totem pole on the cover of the game, and even in the game, there's like one of the mechanics is like advancing your totem path, but like totem poles were not part of any of the cultures of Indigenous people in Manitoba. And so like there's actually a CBC article about this. If you just type into Google a totem pole in Manitoba ? It'll take you to an article on CBC where one of the people with the publishing company, Reiner Stockhausen, tried to sort of defend it as saying like, oh, but like game, it's sort of like creating its own fictional place. Like games can be a mix of like fictional and real and this kind of thing. And anyway, I just think that when you're basically saying, it would be like making a game set in Spain and then like putting the Eiffel Tower in, and then someone calls you out and you're like, oh, whatever, but it's in Europe. It's pretty much the same. Like, it's lazy, and it's basically trying to take advantage of a culture or a people just to kind of like sell your game or drive interest in your game, and to do it in a way where it's like you could have done some pretty basic research, hired a cultural consultant. There's a lot of ways to avoid publishing a game like this. And I will just say to the one of the designers, Remo Consadori, who spoke up in the thread there, he did say that had like none of this stuff had any part in the design. This was a decision by the publisher to go into this theme. So anyway, you can read up about it more on Board Game Geek, but that's the one I wanted to talk about in terms of like, I would have been interested to try a game called Manitoba, but based on this, it just feels lazy.
Yeah, it's gone too far if you are not doing your research on topics that you would need to have researched to be able to accurately represent. Yeah, like you said, it's just lazy.
The last thing I want to mention in this ethical game section is, I don't want to get too into this. We talk about companies that have... There are a lot of big companies out there that have maybe like one person associated with a company who has done something reprehensible, or who is, using their power in the world to do something evil. And this is, again, its own topic about like, where do you set your own boundaries? Where do you draw the line for things that you will or won't engage in, and that kind of thing? And I just have to bring up the Harry Potter IP still being used in board games, and just like Harry Potter stuff in general. And I think just based on what J.K. Rowling has revealed about herself, being anti-trans and like directly using her money and power to directly harm people and make people's lives more difficult. If it's a game that like, I don't say that by all accounts we should just stop engaging with everything Harry Potter. If you have books that you've already bought in your house and things like that, like I'm not telling you don't read your books or don't let your kids read these books or whatever. I just don't, for me personally, I draw the line at spending money on things that are going to make people like this more rich, who are directly using their power and their status and whatnot to make the lives of other people more difficult. So I kind of draw the line just on spending money on those games. In terms of playing with them or discussing them in other ways, it's just really hard to say because of how many other people might be affiliated with that company who might be out of work from something, and boycotting is going really far. And again, we're late into a long episode. I'm going to probably have to just cut this off here because we could go on about this for longer, but I will just say, putting the money in the pockets of someone like that is where I draw the line.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that, there is nuance that we won't have time to discuss here, but like in the sense that just like we just described the Manitoba game and how the designers responded saying that the publisher and how they incorporated the theme was completely separate from the design. I think it's also possible that, like how we've seen with some of these new Lord of the Rings games, that the design behind the game, the designers, could be completely removed from the integration of the Harry Potter IP. And so the answer in my mind isn't necessarily you just say, get rid of it. Like this is like, because there's an aspect that is being done that is completely separate from that, but it is a question of, why are we still continuing to promote and like sort of add that IP theme to things, and drawing the line on spending money on it is, I think, a good way to sort of get around that, because if people stop buying those things, they'll stop being made. The sad part is that like, they're continuing to be made because they're cash cows, right? And it hasn't really stopped being a cash cow.
Yeah, exactly. All right, well, at this point, I feel like we've potentially overstayed our welcome a little bit, so maybe we should get out of here. But I will say before we wrap things up that for all of our listeners, you can find all of our videos and the majority of our content on our YouTube channel at youtube.com/allyoucanboard. If you'd like to chat with us and our amazing community about that, or this episode, or anything else, come join our Discord. You can find the link in our show notes. If you'd like to support the show, please consider leaving a review on your podcast platform of choice, or help spread the word by recommending us to someone you know. And lastly, if you're interested in supporting us financially so that we can continue to grow All You Can Board and continue to improve the quality of everything we're doing, please consider checking out our Patreon page at www.patreon.com/allyoucanboard. Otherwise, this has been episode 5 of the All You Can Board podcast. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you'll join us again in 2 weeks for episode 6.